So, as Nuno said, I work on social behavior in rodents, which is not what I'm going to talk about this evening, luckily. So today I'm going to talk about the contemplative neuroscience of happiness, the nature of the wandering mind. So contemplative neuroscience, which I didn't know at the time what it was called, is one of the reasons I actually got involved in neuroscience in the first place. So what is contemplative science? So contemplative science tries to marry together, to combine the mechanistic approaches that we're familiar with in the West, the way of looking at the mind through behavior, through biology, and historically, through looking at it through things like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and anxiety, and combining this with ancient contemplative traditions that have spent thousands of years developing cognitive technologies to look at our mind. And central to this is what we were just talking about in the last question, and that's mindfulness. Mindfulness has many components, but it focuses on focusing on attention, and crucially, not identifying the feelings and sensations that we have as being part of ourselves. It's the difference between saying, I am angry, and I am experiencing anger. When we combine these two things, we get something that looks a little bit like this. So this is a Tibetan monk of the Mahayana tradition wearing an EEG helmet. And actually, Richard Davison talks about the first time that they started doing these studies in the 70s with monks. And the first monk that came out wired up this way. The other monks laughed, and they didn't understand why at first. But without the knowledge of biology, they were surprised that the electrodes were on the head and not on the heart. So combining these two different approaches actually has a lot of methodological and conceptual issues that we're still trying to resolve. Nonetheless, the number of publications in this area has increased. And as Morten was just saying, it seems as though combining these mindfulness strategies with the existing Western techniques of cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectic behavioral therapy, we're doing a lot to help people with depression and anxiety become much happier. So the question is, what is happiness from the perspective of these contemplative traditions? For them, happiness, much like also Morten said, is the end of suffering. It's the removal of these negative feelings and sensations. So this raises a question. From their perspective, what is suffering? So the suffering, from this perspective, is that all things are impermanent. Our thoughts, our feelings, our sensations, even ourselves, they rise and pass away. Yet, we develop habitual cravings or attachments to these sensory or mental objects that we like, and we develop an aversion to sensory or mental objects that we don't like. The name that's given to these attachments that develop from these models we build of the world is called the monkey mind. We would call this mind wandering. We all know this feeling. Sometimes you're driving to work, and 10 minutes later, you realize that you weren't really focusing on what you were doing, but your mind was somewhere else. And humans, amongst many animal species, have a privileged ability to put themselves very far into the future and into the past, and create situations that have not even occurred. But it seems as though this comes at a cost. These traditions point out that this is one of the sources of unhappiness. And because of this, they see happiness as a skill. It's not simply a state that we have or that we enjoy. It's actually a cognitive process that we train, a way of calming this monkey mind, this wandering mind. So they believe that mind wandering prevents happiness. And from the thousands of years they have of looking inward at themselves, there's evidence for this. But is there evidence from this from a Western psychological perspective? So what I'm going to show you now is some evidence of exactly this. So what you see here is an iPhone app. Unfortunately, it's only available on iPhone and not available on Android, which is slightly frustrating. Nonetheless, what this app does is it asks the individuals random times throughout the day 3 different questions. The first question is, how happy are you? This is measured on a scale of 1 to 100 by this little slider you see on the screen behind you. The second is, what are you doing? Are you working? Are you traveling to work? Are you eating? Are you having sex? Are you eating? Many things. And then third, it asks you the question, is your mind wandering? And so are you thinking about something other than what you're doing, which is the canonical definition of this? And they separate into 3 categories, whether it is something pleasant, something unpleasant, or something neutral. Now, the first thing that's striking that came out of this study is that 47% of the reports they received, people were thinking about something other than what they were doing. This shows that this monkey mind, this wandering mind, is ubiquitous and takes up much of our time. The other thing that's crucial that they found was that, in general, when people are present-focused, they're much happier than when they're mind-wandering. Now, I'm sure you might think there's many things you don't like doing dishes, or doing some annoying work, or being stuck in traffic. So you might think that when our mind is wandering to a pleasant place, that this might be more enjoyable than being in the present. However, for all of the categories, for all 22 instances, from commuting to anything else, they always found that people were at least as happy being in the present moment than when their mind wandered. So as the author of this paper states, like if you were to be gambling on happiness, you would never place your bet on mind wandering because you would always lose. And interestingly, our mind wanders 47% of the time and never less than 30% of the time. But to draw a parallel with Morton's talk, and an interesting methodology perhaps, is that one situation is that during sex, our mind wanders only 10%, which could be a measure of the quality of that sex. So one other analysis that they did was they looked at the relationship between mind wandering and unhappiness. And they did this as they're collecting many reports from individuals, 65,000 in total. So they look at when your mind is wandering, and then they look at the next report and see how happy you are. Or look at how happy you are, look at the next report, and see if your mind is wandering. And although it's known that unhappiness does lead to mind wandering, what they found was surprising is that mind wandering actually seems to have a stronger effect on subsequent unhappiness than unhappiness has on subsequent mind wandering. So these two things do seem to be deeply interrelated. So, if happiness, this control over a wandering mind, is a skill, then how do we train this skill? What is the methodology? And from these contemplative traditions, the cognitive technology that they have developed is something called mindfulness meditation, which we were just speaking about. So in the process of mindfulness meditation, one chooses an object, often sensation on the body or breath. They bring their attention to that. They notice whenever their mind moves to a distraction. And like I said before, they don't identify that distraction as part of themselves, but something they're experiencing. The difference between being happy and having a happy experience. So let's try this for a moment to see what it's like. If I could, with your permission, ask you all to close your eyes just for a minute. So what I'd like you to do is just continue to breathe normally, but focus your attention just on the top of your lip and at the base of your nose. And notice as the air passes, as you breathe out, and passes back again as you breathe in. So you may notice that your mind wanders. If your mind does wander, just gently, easily, bring it back to the sensation of breath and continue. Okay, so open your eyes, please. So if anyone was able to keep their attention on their breath and not have their mind wander, could they please raise their hand? It's a little bit bright. So if you look around you, you can see that very few people raise their hand. And this is part of the reason I became interested in neuroscience, is that why is it that this organ that apparently is under my control does not do what I want it to do? I'm telling it to focus on breath, yet somehow it wanders off somewhere else, and I have to bring it back. This in itself is not intuitive. It's not clear why this would be the case. So I started to wonder, what is going on in my brain whenever it is wandering without my permission? And the resting state network, also known as the default mode network, that Morton already mentioned, is a specific pattern of interrelated neural areas that, when they act in concert, seem to underpin this sense of mind wandering. It involves a relationship between this area called the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. And mind wandering often involves self-referential thoughts, thinking about oneself in the future, talking to someone, maybe going over a conversation you didn't like, or remembering yourself in a context that you did. And this default mode network has been implicated in lapses of attention. Whenever we're doing something boring, we know that our mind wanders. This often produces errors in that task. And it's implicated in conditions such as depression, as well as ADHD. But the default mode network actually poses quite a complex problem for neuroscientists. So normally when we're trying to understand the brain, we build a task in which the animal or the person has to do something in particular. And we have predictions that allows us to look at the brain activity in a certain way that makes sense. But this network is active exactly at the times when we're not doing anything. So this gives the contemplative traditions a window into neuroscience. It becomes something useful for us because they have developed technologies, mental technologies that allow us to analyze ongoing experience and explain this in a way that makes sense. Also, as this default mode network seems to underpin a wandering mind, and meditation, mindfulness meditation, is supposed to address this. This seems like a good place to start to see the effects that meditation has on the brain. So what I'm going to talk to you about now is a study where they compare the neural activity of meditators with novices. So these meditators have gone through more than 10,000 hours of meditation practice. And the people they'll be compared to, what we call controls, will be matched for age, ethnicity, race, education status, and many other things. And what they will do is they will put them each in the scanner, they will meditate on the practice they have learned, or the one they have just been trained in, and compare that neural activity. So in this study, they look at 3 forms of mindfulness meditation. In some senses, they are all very similar, in that you focus on one object. The first is concentration meditation, which we're now all familiar with. We just did it now. The second is loving kindness meditation, which was mentioned just over here before, which is that the object of focus, rather than your breath, is simply this sense of warmth for all living things. And this third one, choiceless awareness, is a focus on being non-judgmental, while one allows thoughts to rise in their mind, stay for as long as they want to move, without trying to continue or suppress them. And through this, as you focus on non-judgmental responses, it allows you to experience these thoughts without reacting to them. Again, central to all these practices is the non-identification with the distractions that you feel. They're not about you, they're just experiences that are ongoing. And in the following plots, concentration meditation will be colored in green, loving kindness meditation in red, and choiceless awareness in blue. So, what we're going to do now is look at their neural activity, which is measured in the MRI scanner that I showed before, non-invasively by looking at blood flow, which we use as a proxy for the activity of neurons in that region. So, what I'm showing here is the activity of all the meditators averaged together and collapsed. And then we subtract the activity of all the controls engaged in the same practices and take that away. And indeed, what we see is these 2 crucial areas, that medial prefrontal cortex region you saw before, and the posterior cingulate cortex, are much less active in meditators when they engage in meditation. And here is that same data plotted a different way. So on the y-axis here is what I'm showing is that bold signal, the measurement of blood, that is a proxy for neural activity. As you can see, meditators show, during meditation, much less activity than do controls. And they also report that their minds wander less. But the question is, can we see a part of the brain that's involved in this process? Are they doing something different that we can see instantiated in the way that their brain is behaving? So one region you might think would be implicated in this is called the insula. This region is related to interoceptive awareness, to the tracking of ongoing physical experience. And like I said, a point of mindfulness meditation is to not identify with the experience as part of oneself. It's not self-referential. It's just about experience. So perhaps this region is more active. So now what they do is they do a specific analysis of this brain data where they look at the posterior cingulate cortex and they look for regions in the brain that predict activity in the PCC. And indeed, what they see is in meditators, more than controls, is that this area known as the insula is more activated. It seems as though one way of stopping the wandering mind is by focusing on this ongoing experience, which we see with the insula activation. But I'm sure many of the audience would raise this question if I wasn't to bring this up myself, which is that we're comparing two groups of people, one that have been doing meditation for many years and for many hours, and one group that has never done it. But we don't know if the meditation is responsible for the changes in the brain, or whether the fact these people just had different brains, so they were more likely to engage in meditation. The fact that their brains were different may have selected them to be more likely to engage in this practice. So to address this study is looking at individuals that signed on for a mindfulness-based stress reduction course. So everyone involved in this study has had no prior meditation experience, but is interested in meditation. So the selection is the same. And what they do is they compare individuals who've gone through the course to individuals that were put on a wait list, and we'll do it after the experiment is over. So they're comparing 12 8 weeks experienced meditators with those that have never done it before. And the task that they're going to give them is either you engage in mindfulness meditation, like the one we have practiced ourselves, or tell stories to yourself about yourself. And what they see, this telling stories about oneself is very similar to the default mode network activity that we talked about before. And again, what they see is this Insula region, after only 8 weeks, is, again, increased in activity. And if you compare this between the meditation practitioners recently trained to those that have not done the training, this Insula region is no more active than it would be. Or sorry, the Insula activity is greater in the meditation group than it would be otherwise. Which again seems to point towards this particular brain region being important for modulating this wandering mind. But in some ways, this is not incredibly interesting to neuroscientists, because if I take someone who is a professional cyclist and I compare them to someone who has not ridden a bike before, when they're trying to ride a bike, one might expect to find something different, though it is hard to test this in an MRI scanner for a variety of reasons. So what they're looking at here is, and to be fair, this suffers from some of the limitations of the first study I mentioned, in that there may be a self-selection bias. However, now what they're looking at is the effects of meditation on the structure of the brain. So they take a large sample of individuals from many ages who have performed between 7 and 9 hours of meditation per day and have attended at least one 10-day-long, 10-hour silent meditation retreat. And what they're going to look at is the thickness of the cortex. Our brain, unfortunately, like many other parts of our bodies, becomes somewhat degraded with time. The cortex is no different. And what we see when we compare the thickness of this cortical region between individuals that do not engage in meditation and those that have engaged in mindfulness meditation, what we see is a very different relationship, particularly in the insula. With time, this particular region thins, but those engaging in meditation, it does not seem to. And this is also the same for this area called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is actually implicated in these other two studies, but I didn't have time to talk about it. So what for me is interesting about all this is that it seems as though individuals with their eyes shut, or half open if you practice Zen, sitting in a room, engaging in a particular cognitive process, are able to change the function, the activity, and even the structure of their brains. And again, to a neuroscientist, this is somewhat trivial in that our brains are changing all the time. Genes are being transcribed, cells are increasing their connections with other cells or decreasing them, and some of them are dying. And also, when we learn anything, when we do pretty much anything, our brain is changing. If we go out and for a drink, our brains are changing. If we learn a new language, our brains are changing. And if we run into a wall, well, our brains change. But when I think about learning a new skill, for example, playing a song on the guitar, so I think of a plan. I move my hand to pick up the guitar, I feel the thumb on the back of the neck, and the strings underneath the fingers, and I get proprioceptive feedback through my hand that gives me a signal from the outside world, and I hear the sounds the instrument makes. And it's this closed loop with the outside world that we often think is the cause of the way in which our brain is changing. But somehow, through this process of meditation, it seems as though this organ is, in an intentional and planned manner, changing itself. This is one of the reasons I became interested in neuroscience in the first place, is to try and understand how this organ seems to be willfully changing its own activity and structure. So what I've tried to explain today is that We are most happy when we are focused on what we are doing, rather than when our mind is wandering. This default mode network, this resting state network, appears to be related to mind wandering. Meditation, it reduces the activity of this network, and it recruits other brain areas to change the way that it functions. And this can lead to long-lasting structural changes in the brain. So in many ways, meditation sounds fantastic. But before I leave on that, I would like to say a word of caution. There are many other things that seem to cause similar effects on this default mode network. Magic mushrooms, for example, have recently been shown to cause lasting changes in default mode network and to reduce depression both in patients with terminal illnesses and chronic depression. Sensory deprivation can also have this effect. Sleep deprivation as well, exercise, smoking. Nicotine is a psychostimulant. So brief reductions in default mode network activity can be caused by having a cigarette or an e-cigarette, if that's your interest. More than that, there also might be a negative cost to these practices. So these practices come from most of them come from a different culture, and many of them are explored socially. Whereas where this is sold in the West, it's often a private practice. So how this changes things is not clear. And also to establish a new practice, one that is not necessarily so well aligned with the way we think about things, it's often good to look at the things it does best. So for thousands of years, they've been saying that meditation can make you more focused. It can make your mind wander less. And indeed, when we look at it, it seems to do those things. But if this default mode network is important for planning, important for our ability to look forward into the future and back into the past, and imagine ourselves in places that we haven't been, we don't know what effect these processes have on, say, creativity. And there's much subtler aspects that we don't yet understand, although the effects do seem to be positive. One thing that does seem clear from this is that happiness comes not from focusing upon oneself. It comes from oneself being focused. And whatever your path you choose, whether it's meaning, pleasure, whatever else, it seems better to do this mindfully than with a full mind. Any questions?
So again, we have time for a couple of questions. So just raise your hand. And you can ask the questions in Portuguese.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. I've got one question for you. Mm-hmm. In this day and age of so much information around us, with all mobile phones, with emails and all this, and we are supposed to be multitasking, right? Mm-hmm. And even we have the perception, for instance, that women are very good at being multitasking, okay? What are your views on this multitasking thing? Are we really supposed to be multitasking? Can we be multitasking?
So personally, I'm not good at this. It seems if you connect it to this research that if one is being mindful, they might be more able to focus on a given task and then move to another. I think often multitasking might come from the fact that we're not necessarily scheduling what we're doing so well. Like maybe being focused on one task and completing it, and then moving to the next one is more effective than trying to do 3 or 4 things at the same time.
More questions? All right, there's one question there. Yeah.
Yes, I would like to ask you if you think that meditation could be something to explore in the treatment of ADHD.
So there is research into this. So mindfulness-based treatments seem to be quite effective, or at least they're beginning to be explored, and the results are positive. The default mode network is implicated a lot in patients with ADHD. So whenever people are engaging in a task that's fairly simple, they often have this network activate, and they become distracted. And with people that have ADHD, it seems that this happens more often, that the default mode network regularly impedes upon the task they're trying to do. And if you're focused on one thing and this network activates, you might move your attention to something else and become focused on that. So it seems as though mindfulness meditation would be very effective for conditions like this.
Thank you.
Boa noite. Será que posso fazer em português e é traduzida?
Sim.
A pergunta tem a ver com a relação de as pessoas rezarem e até que ponto isso se compara com uma narrativa ou até com meditação.
Com as pessoas?
Rezarem.
Rezarem.
Se expressos, se aproximam mais com as narrativas ou com a meditação.
So the question is regarding praying and whether praying is more related to, you said,
Com o efeito da narrativa no cérebro ou
all right,
com a
so
meditação?
more regarding the storytelling or the actual meditation.
So there is some work done with prayer. So the contemplative neuroscience I described, I mainly talked about things like Buddhism, but it also includes Christian practices as well. So there is work with Franciscan nuns that looks and seems to see that the same sort of protective effects on aging in the brain are there. And I think it depends on the type of prayer. Like, for example, if you're saying the same thing over and over again and focusing on that, that's something very similar to mindfulness. But if it's a penitential prayer, where you're asking for something in particular, this seems like a very different cognitive process. So I think it depends very much on the type of prayer and the way it's being said.
My question is about the creative process.
The what, sorry?
The creative process, for example, of an artist. If someone is trying to paint something, it has a lot to do with mind wandering. Lots of thoughts come to their minds, and that leads to the creative process of producing something, whether it is a painting or a sculpture or whatever. Don't you think that if you are too focused on what you are doing, the exact physical act of painting, at the same time you are not doing that mind wandering that leads to the creation of the piece of art? How we deal with this?
I guess the way I think about this is that many of the ideas for the painting or for everything that you're trying to do might come from mind wandering. It allows you more access to different thoughts, to imagine yourself in different places and come up with new ideas. But I think many people who are engaging in the actual act of painting in a moment will be quite focused. The flow that Nuno described, for many artists, might be a state that they get into. And during that period, I don't think their mind is wandering. In fact, flow is kind of defined by the absence of mind wandering. But then if you're too focused all the time, there may not be the interesting ideas that come up. That's kind of the concern I was raising about meditation in general, is that if you are completely focused and you're not allowing your mind to go to places that aren't up to you, then maybe you miss out on a lot of creative possibilities. And I think that's a risk of this. Although it does seem as though our minds wander a pathological amount. So limiting it a little bit probably won't hurt.
Thank you.
So, okay, we have one last question.
Okay.
This one.
What kind of concept of meditation are you talking about here? What exactly is a meditation is exercising our mind, like seeking for a peace in our minds, or what kind of exercises can we do for reaching that state of mindfulness? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I don't think I'm entirely qualified to say exactly that. I'm not a meditation teacher at all. But I think the type of meditation we tried here, this simple mindfulness meditation, is one way of practicing this. But it's not, they would argue that it's not about seeking something, because that would be against the meditative process. You're not supposed to attach oneself to something they want. So you're not supposed to attach yourself to the outcome of the process, but merely engage in the process itself. So the outcome, in some senses, is something one should not look at directly. It's merely engaging in a process and seeing what comes out of it. But I feel like I haven't really answered your question.
No, because you're talking about meditation and the consequence of meditation in happiness. So I didn't understood the concept of meditation. It's just like about going to a room and practicing. What kind of thing is that?
So I think there are many forms of meditation. The ones I was trying to describe here are often done with others, in that you all sit in a room, probably with your eyes closed, and you engage in a very specific way of thinking, a cognitive exercise. But yoga is also a form of meditation. Some people would argue that if you think about The idea of meditation in general is that it becomes a normal aspect of your everyday life. So if you're exercising and you're running, you're also still trying to be mindful. Or if you're talking to a friend or someone you care for, you're also trying to be mindful. So it's a practice, a way of changing the way we focus ourselves and then applying that to everyday life.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott.